Imagine standing in a crowded medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread and horse manure, a mix of life and labor. Suddenly, the crowd parts. A woman is being dragged through the square, her hair shorn, her garments torn and marked with ink. She is not a murderer. She is not a thief. Her crime is impurity, a word as vague as the whispers that follow her. People jeer, some out of fear, others because it is safer to join the condemnation than to risk it themselves. At the center of this display is power, the power to define what is pure and what is not, and to use that definition to break people in public. Purity laws were never just about morals. They were about control. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, rulers, priests, and local magistrates decided whose behavior threatened divine order and whose suffering would restore it. By calling their punishments holy, they disguised cruelty as virtue. These laws were rooted in the belief that a community could be stained by individual sin, that a single act of lust, disobedience, or even unconventional dress could invite disaster upon everyone. And so the solution was simple and brutal. Expose the offender, shame them, hurt them if necessary, and make an example for all to see. In medieval France, sumptuary laws dictated what women could wear, down to the fabrics and colors. Clothing was not just fashion, it was a signal of rank and virtue. A woman accused of promiscuity could be forced to parade half-dressed through the streets as penance. In Florence, such rituals were even written into the statutes, codifying humiliation as part of civic order. These punishments sent a clear message. Purity was not private, it was a public performance, and those who failed would be made into spectacles of scorn. The idea of holy pain was widespread. In England, public whippings for fornication were held outside parish churches, where the faithful could watch and learn. In German towns, women accused of adultery were sometimes locked into wooden collars called neck violins, clamped face to face with their supposed lovers, and paraded through the marketplace to mock applause. The punishment did not just hurt the flesh. It crushed the spirit by turning neighbors into witnesses, judges, and executioners all at once. Behind these scenes of cruelty stood the clergy and secular authorities, bound together by a shared obsession, keeping society clean. Purity laws blurred the line between religion and politics. In Catholic Europe, bishops declared that female sexuality threatened divine favor. In Protestant towns, ministers railed from pulpits about sin rotting communities from within. In Islamic empires, qadis and scholars enforced codes of modesty with lashings and exile. Across cultures, the logic was the same. If women could be controlled, then society could be controlled. But the victims were not always women. Men accused of deviating from moral norms faced punishments that attacked their honor, their bodies, and their ability to stand as upright citizens. In Renaissance Italy, male prostitutes were branded on the face to warn others. In Ottoman markets, men caught with mistresses were stripped to the waist and beaten while crowds shouted insults. Yet the punishments inflicted on women carried a special symbolism. They targeted the very things that defined women in the eyes of medieval society: their appearance, their voices, their sexuality, and their supposed duty to obey. Witch hunts are perhaps the most infamous example of purity laws turned into public torture. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of women across Europe were accused of serving the devil. But the language of these accusations was often deeply gendered. Witches were said to seduce men, to spoil marriages, to tempt priests. Their trials were spectacles, with interrogators demanding confessions about imagined sexual crimes. Even when physical torture was not applied, the humiliation alone was devastating. Women were stripped, examined, and paraded before neighbors who had known them for years. The punishment was not only death by fire or rope. It was a social death long before the pyre was lit. Sometimes the tools of punishment themselves told the story. The scold's bridle, a cage of iron locked over the head with a tongue press inside, was used in Scotland and England to silence gossips. Women accused of speaking too freely, often about men in power. This was called moral correction, but it was really about obedience. By forcing silence in public, it showed every passerby what would happen to a woman who dared speak without permission. Other devices, like the wooden pillory or the iron collar, held victims in place while the crowd delivered its own justice with insults, mud, or stones. These were community rituals, meant to terrify as much as to punish. The obsession with purity was not limited to Europe. In Ming Dynasty China, laws against adultery and licentious behavior carried severe consequences. Women were paraded in shame processions, bound and barefoot, holding placards describing their alleged crimes. In parts of the Islamic world, women accused of dishonoring their families could be lashed in marketplaces, the spectacle framed as both a legal sentence and a divine warning. The goal was always the same: to make private conduct into public theater, to remind everyone that their bodies were not fully their own. The idea that sin polluted the entire community gave rulers extraordinary power. It meant that any accusation of impurity could justify swift and brutal action, because to delay was to risk divine wrath. The crops failed or plague struck. Who was to blame? The authorities pointed to the unfaithful wife, the bold daughter, the wayward son. By punishing them publicly, leaders claimed they were protecting everyone else. In reality, these punishments protected only the ruler's own authority. Even in cases where no physical pain was inflicted, the humiliation could be unbearable. A woman might be forced to shave her head, wear a special garment marked with symbols of shame, or walk barefoot through icy streets. A man might be stripped of his belt and sword, signs of his honor, and displayed like a common criminal. These punishments worked because they destroyed reputations, which in pre-modern societies were as vital as bread. In towns where everyone knew each other, a single public disgrace could ruin a family for generations. To understand how purity laws became torture, we must see them not as isolated incidents but as part of a wider system. These punishments were deliberate performances, staged with an audience, designed to teach obedience through fear. They blurred justice with theater, piety with power. And at their core was an ancient anxiety about human desire, an urge to control the uncontrollable by branding it as dangerous, filthy, or sinful. The church bell rings, and the villagers gather, drawn not by devotion but by the promise of a lesson. At the edge of the square stands a wooden post, already darkened by old stains. A magistrate steps forward, holding a parchment covered with words that few can read but all can understand. A young man has been accused of fornication, of breaking the sacred order. He is tied to the post, stripped to his shirt, while the crowd murmurs. The lash will fall, but it is the staring eyes, the whispering mouths, the clucking tongues that do the real damage. Everyone sees and everyone learns. In this way, purity laws worked not by punishing the guilty alone, but by teaching everyone else to fear the same fate. Purity was always a moving target. In some towns, even holding hands in public could be considered scandalous. In others, an accusation was enough, no proof required. A rival could whisper, a jealous neighbor could point, and suddenly a family's honor was on trial. The power to accuse was almost as dangerous as the power to punish. Those in authority knew this and used it well. A fearful community polices itself, each person watching the other, eager to prove loyalty by condemning someone else. Nowhere was this clearer than in the treatment of women. Female honor was seen as a fragile thing, easily stained, and therefore in constant need of supervision. Husbands guarded wives, fathers guarded daughters, and the law guarded them all. Not to protect women themselves, but to protect male reputation and property. A woman accused of impurity did not merely face punishment. She risked losing her dowry, her marriage prospects, even her right to live in her own home. Public humiliation was the easiest weapon to wield. A shaved head, a torn dress, a forced confession shouted aloud. These left no physical scars, yet they destroyed lives. Even queens and noblewomen were not immune. In 15th century France, rumors of adultery against royal mistresses were enough to summon tribunals. In Germany, noble women could be paraded through town in special carts, faces exposed for all to see. This ritualized shaming sent a message to every woman in the realm. No one stood above moral law as defined by men. The language of purity became a cloak for jealousy, politics, and raw power. The punishments often borrowed from theater. Consider the chivalry, a noisy ritual where villagers banged pots and pans outside the homes of those accused of immoral behavior. A man marrying too young, a widow remarrying too quickly, or lovers meeting in secret. Sometimes the targets were forced to ride backward on a donkey through town while children and neighbors mocked them. The goal was not simply to correct behavior but to broadcast the lesson to everyone nearby. Step outside the rules and you will be made into a joke. Shame was a currency, and authorities spent it freely. In Renaissance Italy, men convicted of brothel keeping were sometimes forced to wear women's clothing as they marched to their punishment. In 17th century England, prostitutes were dragged through streets tied to carts, pelted with refuse by the crowd. The humiliation was meant to be worse than the pain. This public theater blurred crime and sin, law and gossip, justice and entertainment. Why did societies go to such lengths to enforce purity? Part of the answer lies in fear of the uncontrollable, of desire, of female independence, of anything that could not be neatly ruled by decree. Purity laws tried to make human behavior predictable, to draw bright lines where nature had none. By punishing individuals in front of a crowd, rulers hoped to draw a circle of safety around the rest of society. But this safety was an illusion. The more a community punished impurity, the more suspicious it became, and the more likely innocent people were to fall under suspicion. Religious authorities claimed that these punishments saved souls. A public flogging or a walk of shame was framed as a kind of medicine, curing both the offender and the onlookers. But in reality, the medicine was poison. It spread fear, resentment, and cruelty. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families betrayed daughters and sons. The law that claimed to purify the community instead corroded its heart. Sometimes these laws became tools of open political repression. In Spain during the Inquisition, accusations of moral impurity were used to target not only alleged heretics but also anyone who stood in the way of powerful interests. People who questioned the wealth of the church or the authority of the crown could be smeared as adulterers, sodomites, or witches. In such cases, the public humiliation was more important than any trial. Once a person was paraded through the streets in disgrace, their reputation was ruined, and with it, their ability to resist. The instruments of shame could be simple or elaborate. A wooden yoke called a kang in China held the accused in a rigid frame, with the charges painted on the wood for all to read. In Scotland, the jugs, an iron collar fixed to the church wall, held offenders in place while parishioners passed by, spitting insults. These devices did not kill, but they left deep scars nonetheless. They reminded everyone that their lives were not their own, that their bodies and reputations were subject to the judgment of others. Even when torture devices were used, they were often justified as holy. The pear of anguish, an instrument later mythologized as a tool for punishing immoral women, was described in lurid detail by later writers, though historians now debate whether it was truly used for that purpose or invented as propaganda. The chastity belt, another infamous object, may have been more legend than fact, but the legend itself shows how people imagined control over the body. Locked, guarded, owned by someone else. Whether these devices were real or not mattered less than the fear they represented. The spectacle of purity laws turned public squares into open-air courts. Punishments were scheduled for market days, when the largest crowd would see them. In many towns, church bells summoned people not only to prayer but also to witness penance. A woman forced to kneel in rags outside a cathedral, holding a candle as wide as her arm, became a living sermon. Children were brought by their parents to watch, to learn what would happen to anyone who broke the rules. Through these rituals, entire generations grew up associating shame with virtue, cruelty with holiness. The cruel irony was that these punishments rarely prevented the behaviors they claimed to stop. Human desire did not vanish under threat of the lash or the iron collar. Instead, people became better at hiding, better at lying, and far more afraid. Authorities mistook silence for obedience, and obedience for purity, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Over time, this fear turned to anger, and that anger would eventually help fuel revolutions against the very systems that enforced these laws. As the centuries turned, whispers began to rise against these practices. Scholars, reformers, and even some clergy questioned whether public shame truly cleansed the soul or simply fed the cruelty of crowds. In towns across Europe, punishments once taken for granted began to spark unease. Was this really justice, or merely vengeance dressed in holy robes? One of the first cracks appeared when legal thinkers started to separate sin from crime. In medieval law, impurity was treated as a threat to the entire community, something that demanded collective punishment. But by the 17th century, jurists began to ask whether the state had any business policing private morals at all. This shift was slow and uneven. In some places, public shaming rituals were abolished. In others, they became harsher than ever, as authorities clung to old ways in the face of change. In Puritan New England, stocks and pillories still lined the village green, and women accused of sexual misconduct were whipped through the streets. But at the same time, European philosophers were writing about individual rights and human dignity. The idea that people were not merely subjects of a ruler or children of a church, but individuals with personal freedom, began to spread. With that idea came a question that shook the foundations of purity laws. If a sin harms no one but the sinner, why should the state intervene at all? Even so, the machinery of shame did not vanish overnight. In parts of France, England, and Italy, forced penance continued well into the 18th century. Men and women still walked barefoot in chains, carrying candles or wearing placards announcing their alleged crimes. But gradually, these punishments lost their audience. What once drew crowds of jeering neighbors now stirred quiet pity or even anger. The spectacle of humiliation no longer convinced people that society was being purified. Instead, it revealed how far authorities would go to maintain control. The rise of printing presses and pamphlets helped turn the tide. Ordinary people could now read accounts of wrongful accusations, of innocents paraded and punished for nothing more than gossip or personal grudges. As these stories spread, public opinion shifted. Punishment was no longer viewed as a sacred ritual to cleanse sin, but as a tool that could be misused, corrupted, and cruel. The very same public that once gathered eagerly to watch became restless, even rebellious. This shift reached its peak during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that laws should be rational, humane, and aimed at protecting society rather than enforcing religious virtue. Beccaria's 1764 book on crimes and punishments called for an end to torture and public humiliation, insisting that such practices were not only barbaric but also ineffective. His ideas spread quickly across Europe and the Americas, influencing rulers and lawmakers. Gradually, punishments rooted in purity laws were replaced by fines, imprisonment, or private discipline. The stage of public cruelty went dark. Yet the shadow of these laws lingers. The obsession with controlling bodies, especially female bodies, did not vanish with the Enlightenment. It simply changed form. In the 19th century, many societies shifted from open, theatrical punishments to quieter forms of moral control, asylums, workhouses, and reform schools. Women accused of immorality could still be locked away, not before a crowd this time, but behind closed doors, hidden from view. The spirit of purity laws endured even as the spectacle disappeared. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that we have outgrown such cruelty, that the world of pillories and scolds bridles is long gone. But echoes remain. Whenever laws are written to regulate personal behavior rather than protect people from harm, we can hear the faint tolling of those old church bells summoning the crowd. Whenever a community shames rather than understands, punishes rather than helps, the ancient theater of purity reopens its doors. History forces us to confront a sobering truth. Purity laws were never truly about holiness. They were about power, the power to define who belonged and who did not, who was worthy and who was stained. By branding certain people as impure, rulers strengthened their own authority and bound communities together in fear. Pain was presented as medicine, humiliation as virtue, but the real sickness was control itself. Imagine again that medieval marketplace. The crowd gathers, the accused stands trembling, and the lash falls, or perhaps no lash at all, only the cruel laughter of neighbors. Now step outside that scene and see it for what it truly is. Not divine justice, not holy correction, but human beings wielding power over other human beings, using shame as a weapon. This is the essence of how purity laws turned into public torture. It is a history worth remembering, not to gawk at past horrors, but to recognize their logic when it appears in new disguises. Whenever we see laws justified by vague appeals to decency or moral order, we should recall the women paraded through the streets, the men branded as sinners, the children taught to cheer at the suffering of others. These were not acts of faith. They were acts of fear, dressed up as righteousness. And in that recognition lies hope. Because if history teaches anything, it is that cruelty is not destiny. The same societies that once whipped, shamed, and humiliated in the name of purity learned, slowly and painfully, to see the humanity of the condemned. They learned that true strength does not come from breaking people, but from protecting them. They learned that laws are meant to defend freedom, not to destroy it. The echoes of the dark era are still with us, but they need not control us. We can choose to hear them as warnings rather than commands. The bells no longer summon us to the square, but the question remains: will we watch when our neighbors are humiliated? Will we cheer when others are labeled impure? Or will we remember the lessons written in pain, carved into history by those who suffered so that we might see more clearly? The past is not dead. It speaks through the stories of those who endured the lash, the collar, the bridle, the jeering crowd. And it asks us, quietly but insistently, what will you do when purity and power once again walk hand in hand?